Hello there. Welcome to another episode where we talk about innovation. Now, we talked about levels of innovation, and in levels of innovation, we talked about product and service innovation, we talked about process innovation, and we talked about business model innovation. Now that you know about that, in this episode, we are going to talk about degrees of innovation. And I'm going to explain what that means. When you talk about degree of innovation, we're talking about two things. We're talking about incremental innovation and radical innovation. Let's find out what this means. And I'm going to start with an example, or rather, a did you know? This is an example that everybody is aware of. Did you know that if you boil an egg for 1 minute every day, eventually you will just have a spoiled egg? Innovation works the same way. Sometimes you need small steps. Sometimes you need to crack the egg and cook something entirely new, right? So what do we mean when we say degree of innovation? Degree of innovation simply means how big or small the change is from what already exists. Degree. Is it a big change? Is it just a small change to what already exists? Some innovations are small improvements, where others are game changers. So let's start with the first degree of innovation, that is incremental innovation, and let's look at it in a clearer scope. When you talk about incremental innovation, it's small, steady improvements to something that already exists. We are not reinventing the wheel. It's just small, steady improvements to something that already exists. So a simple definition is trying to make something, you've probably heard of this, faster, cheaper, or easier, right? So that's what a lot of startup innovations nowadays look like. When you listen to a lot of a lot of pitching competitions, a lot of founders are talking about how they're trying to make things faster, cheaper, or just easier, right? They're not completely new. So let's talk of some real life examples. For example, when Safaricom added Fuliza to M-Pesa, it was not an entirely new thing. It was just leveraging what already exists. M-Pesa. It's like smartphones getting better cameras every year. For example, every time Samsung releases a new phone, it's probably a better camera or some other added functionality. Just the same product, but you're adding some more features, just small and steady improvements. That's what I mean. So, with that in mind, why does it matter? Is it a good idea to dive into the incremental innovation space? It's a good idea. It's a good idea, especially if you are not a high risk taker. You just want to engage in low risk. You want to test quickly. You want something that customers are already familiar with, right? Because if it's entirely new, customers don't even know about it. So it's a whole new game. But when it comes to incremental, customers are already familiar with it. They already know what a phone is. So it matters if for you, you're not trying to target a whole new domain of customers. It keeps your business fresh and competitive. Imagine if Samsung or iPhone or Apple products, sorry, or Apple products don't engage in incremental innovation. That means whatever product they released in 2007 is just the same product they keep releasing year and year and year over. You can imagine what that looks like. So incremental innovation is definitely a huge plus. And you've seen a lot of products, startup products, leveraging in this space. Disruptive kind of innovation. These are big, bold changes that introduce something totally new, right? In a simple definition, it's a completely new way of doing things that changes the whole game. And a real life example was, first of all, the introduction of M-Pesa, right? At that time, we didn't have another mobile payment platform. And how transactions uh, used to be conducted was informal, relying on a friend. There was banking at that time, but you had to be near a branch or something. Let's talk about the introduction of the car concept decades ago. And you have seen, and the best way to know about a radical innovation is that that specific innovation leads to other forms of innovation coming just because that innovation exists. Let's look about the when the internet was first introduced, and we have seen so many other companies leveraging this innovation of the internet to build their enterprises. Um, that's the example. Another example of M-Pesa. We have seen, because of that big disruptive M-Pesa innovation, so many other small, not small, but so many other startups coming up, leveraging this new opportunity of M-Pesa to dive into the business space and start new things. Another example is when the concept of a car came up. We have seen the growth of industries, different hundreds of thousands of jobs, opportunities, and so much going on. So that's what we mean when we say disruptive innovation, radical innovation. They introduce something new that shakes up the ecosystem, and this matters a lot. Why does it matter? It's because it creates new industries, new opportunities. It's a huge competitive advantage. Look, for example, look at when ChatGPT was introduced to the world, and how many other forms of GPTs that people have innovated from just that example. There's so much we can talk about, and I'm sure right now you're getting the picture. It's a huge competitive advantage because when you come up with something entirely new, it normally takes a long time for others to figure out and how you did it and to start trying to develop, alternative products. It's high risk, I agree. You're trying to get into a market where customers don't exist. You have to find a way to create new customers. It's high risk, but when it works, it's highly rewarding. It usually needs more time, money, and mindset shifts. It's a lot of work that you have to do. A lot of research has to be there, a lot of building and testing and failing. But when it works, definitely a huge plus. So let's do a quick comparison between incremental innovation and radical innovation. When we talk about incremental innovation, we are talking about small improvements. When we talk about radical innovation, we are talking about big transformation. When you talk about incremental innovation, you're talking about low risk level. When you're talking about radical innovation, you're talking about high risk level. When you talk about incremental innovation, an example could be Fuliza, which you're just building on top of another existing platform like M-Pesa. But when you talk about radical innovation, it's a whole other dynamic. Like when M-Pesa was first introduced. When you talk about incremental innovation, customers already exist. It's something that people are already familiar with, and it's easy to welcome it. But when you're talking about radical innovation, it needs education. You need to train people on what your product is all about because it's new. Nobody has seen it, nobody has implemented it before, and requires that you build a lot of trust for people to use your products. When you talk about incremental innovation, it improves what you have or what other people have. When you talk about radical innovation, it reinvents your model. When you talk about incremental innovation, it helps if you already have a business. Incremental innovation is what helps you stay relevant. I think when we are talking about in the earlier sessions, when you talk about you can go obsolete, your business can run obsolete without innovation. This is exactly what you are talking about. If you do not innovate, if you do not improve, you just stagnate, you become obsolete, 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 and you rot away. You become another textbook example to be used in a lecture room. So you have to innovate. You have to do incremental innovation in order for you to improve your offering to your customers. Radical innovation is what helps you stand out and lead the market. Smart innovators mix both depending on the goal and situation. You try to mix a little bit of incremental innovation and disruptive innovation, of course, depending on your needs. So, in summary, what are the things that you should remember from this episode? When you talk about degree of innovation, it means how big or small a change is. When you talk about incremental innovation, it's small upgrades, it's low risk, easy wins. When you talk about radical innovation, it's big changes, it's high risk, high reward. And we gave an example. For example, in Kenya, when you talk about incremental innovation, a good example could be Fuliza, which is just leverages on an existing innovation of the M-Pesa. When you talk about radical innovation, a good example could be the introduction of M-Pesa at that time. You should try to blend both depending on your goal, risk level, and customer needs. Thank you for following along. See you in the next episode.